So in this lecture, I'm going to continue with the introductory chapter of Gandhi's autobiography, the story of my experiments with truth. So in the previous lecture, I had already, pointed out some of the most important things in relation to Gandhi writing this autobiography. So among those were why he started writing, what were some of the objections to his writing, and what his project entails, right? So, again, by way of comparison, I'm going to tell you that for Rabindranath Tagore, in his introductory chapter, he told us why he was writing the autobiography too, right? And in fact, he had claimed that what he was writing was not exactly an autobiography. And here you have Gandhi claiming that what he is writing is not a real autobiography, right? And these differences must be noted because since this is a paper on autobiography, it is important for you as students to learn how to distinguish one autobiography from the other, right? Now, some of the differences are pretty obvious ones. On the one hand, you have Rabindranath Tagore, who is a poet, who is filled with metaphors and alliterative sentences and all of that, right? He's filled with, you know, li- literary exercises, right? He practices or uses literary devices to a great extent. Not in the case of Gandhi. Gandhi, a lawyer by training, a politician or social worker, he writes in a very different languages. His sentences are simple. He targets an entirely different audience, right? So you have to keep in mind these factors as well. These factors are very significant when it comes to writing or publishing anything for that matter, right? Also keep in mind that Gandhi's work was published serially, not in the form of a book. It was later published in the form of a book. But when Mahatma Gandhi was writing the book, he was writing one chapter at a time, and every week one chapter would be published in the magazine, right? So these are some factors we had discussed in the previous chapter, in the previous lesson. So one more important thing to quickly recap before I move forward and talk about some of the excerpts that I want to discuss today is the moral aspect or spiritual aspect of Gandhi's writing. Gandhi has explicitly mentioned that uh, what he's doing is like a scientist, right? How so? Because a scientist conducts experiments and Gandhi conducts experiments with truth. And a scientist, he has a lot of thinking going into his experiment, a lot of foresight, a lot of insight, and finally there are certain conclusions that he draws. But a scientist, at least a good scientist, does not say that these are the only conclusions that can come out of my experiment. A good scientist will always know that it is possible that some of the conclusions may be contradictory to each other. It is always possible that more conclusions are possible, right? Similarly, Gandhi says that I too am of a similar belief. Like any other scientist, I believe that my conclusions are not final. There is always the possibility that uh, there is always the chance that more nuances could be added to the lessons that I have learned in life through my experiments of truth, which I am trying to communicate in my autobiography, right? So these are some of the things that I wanted to be quickly recapitulated before moving forward with uh, the excerpts today. So the first excerpt today is this: if I had only to discuss academic principles, I should clearly not attempt an autobiography. Remember, he makes the distinction between uh, the spiritual way of writing, right, which is his project, or the Western tradition of autobiography, from which he, you know, distances himself from, because he has already said that I'm not writing a, quote unquote real autobiography. I'm not following the Western tradition of narrating my life. I'm rather emphasizing on narrating my experiments with truth. Therefore, in doing so, I'm already removing many of the other experiences I had in life, right? So you see, that is an important distinction between the Western sort of autobiography that Gandhi has in his mind and the autobiography that he's writing. Okay, because he's emphasizing only on certain kind of incidents, but perhaps in his mind, to his understanding, in the Western tradition, those things, the things that he excludes may not have been excluded, or the things that he writes about may not have been included in the Western tradition, right? And when I say Western tradition, do not think that everyone who has written an autobiography in the Western tradition has written the same sort of autobiography, right? This is a very generalized idea, a very reduced idea, right? You may also call it, reductionist idea. Reductionist idea is when, there is a very complex thing, but you have to, you know, compress it uh, for your ease, and that is a reductionist way of thinking, that is a reductionist way of approaching something. So when I say the Western tradition of autobiography, do not imagine that there is only one template for writing a Western autobiography or Western styled autobiography which everyone has done in the West. That is definitely not the case. In this paper itself, in DSE B3, you are reading several autobiographies, and in doing so, I'm sure you have come across differences in all of them. How Gandhi differs from Tagore, I have already told you a little bit, and as we study this text, we are going to see more of those differences. I'm sure you, as students, you are able to see the differences these texts have with the other autobiographies you have read for this paper. So remember, uh, there is no one template that everyone has to follow, right? So keep that in mind, and also keep that in mind that Gandhi is aware of the basic differences between his writing of my experiments, the story of my experiments with truth, and the general template, again, general template used in the Western tradition. So he says that if I had to discuss academic principles, I would not be attempting an autobiography. If I were to tell my ideas of truth, my ideas on spirituality and morality, then I would not be, narrating the incidents of my life. Then I would be doing it like a philosopher, right? That's a different style of writing, a different approach to thinking, to life, etc. But he says, my purpose being to give an account of various practical applications of these principles, I have given the chapters I propose to write the title, "The Story of My Experiments with Truth." So, um, this is an answer. Gandhi himself provides an answer to the very important question: why is this book titled "The Story of My Experiments with Truth"? Or what is the justification to the title of Gandhi's autobiography? So you see, Gandhi himself has provided an answer. He says that I'm not writing this book as a philosopher. I'm just narrating incidents from my life, but I'm narrating specific kinds of incidents from my life, those that have a moral value, those from which I derived a spiritual or moral lesson, and I believe my readers will do too, or may do too, right? Uh, and he reminds his readers that his purpose in writing this book is to give an account of the practical applications of the principles of truth, principles of honesty, principles of loyalty. These are some of the principles he has in mind. You will come across them as you read the text. But these principles he has put in use in his own life, and he has written about what has come out of those. He has told us of incidents where he has not been truthful, where he has lied, and then he has also told us that, told us what has come out of that dishonesty, right? He has given us instances where he stole some money, and then Gandhi himself tells us why he was mistaken in stealing the money. So there are practical applications of all of these ideas, such as truth, loyalty, honesty, right? Faithfulness, and you will come across them as you read the text. So this is the reason why he has given this book the title, "The Story of My Experiments with Truth." So the fundamental question is, why is he calling them experiments? And if you have followed the lectures so far, and if you have read the text, you surely have the answer now, specifically in light of what Gandhi himself has mentioned. So these will, he says, of course include experiments with non-violence, celibacy, and other principles of conduct believed to be distinct from truth. Right? So I've already named some of these principles for you: truth, loyalty, honesty, faithfulness, right? And a few more that Gandhi has mentioned: non-violence, celibacy, and some other principles that you will come across. But for me, truth is the sovereign principle, which includes numerous other principles. So for Gandhi, again, I have already explained why the term experiment is important here. Now let's focus on the term truth, my experiments with truth, right? So let's take up the truth from there and see why. So for Gandhi, truth is the sovereign principle. In other words, truth is like an umbrella term. What do I mean by an umbrella term? An umbrella term is a term under which, just like underneath an umbrella, you can keep yourself safe from the rain. An umbrella term is a term which contains many other terms or which contains many other principles. So he says that honesty, or non-violence, or faithfulness, these are all under the umbrella term of truth. There is an alternative word for umbrella term. It's called a parasol. If you are interested, look it up. Right? So Gandhi says, for me, truth is the sovereign principle, which includes numerous other principles. So truth contains many of the principles that he goes on to talk about. Some principles I have named. Some of those are honesty, faithfulness, non-violence, celibacy, etc., etc. So for Gandhi, these are all under the parasol or umbrella term of truth, and hence the significance of the title. So this explains, hopefully, today's lecture, and specifically this excerpt explains why Gandhi has titled his text "The Story of My Experiments with Truth," with emphasis given on experiments and on truth. Okay, moving on, a longish excerpt. Let those who wish realize how the conviction has grown upon me. Let them share my experiments and share also my conviction if they can. The further conviction has been growing upon me that whatever is possible for me is possible even for a child, and I have sound reasons for saying so. The instruments for the quest of truth are as simple as they are difficult. They may appear quite impossible to an arrogant person and quite possible to an innocent child. The seeker after truth should be humbler than the dust. The world crushes the dust under its feet, but the seeker after truth should so humble himself that even the dust should crush him. Only then, and not till then, will he have a glimpse of truth. The dialogue between Vasistha and Vishwamitra make this abundantly clear. Christianity and Islam also amply bear it out. So now, as he has said before, that he intends his autobiography to inspire others, right? He has certain convictions which he believes, if other people, his followers, know about, will also share those convictions, right? And he says that one of the principles he had in writing this book is that what is possible for him, that is for Gandhi, will also be possible for a simple child, right? Because he says that, the quest for truth is very paradoxical, according to Gandhi, because at the same time it is simple and difficult, right? I hope you understand a paradox. A paradox is something which is mutually contradictory, right? So to give you an example of a paradox, think of this sentence: if a liar if a liar tells you that he or she is a liar, then is he or she telling the truth, or is he lying at all, right? So if a liar says I am a liar, then he's telling the truth. Then obviously he or she is not a liar. And if he or she is not a liar, then how is he saying I'm a liar, right? So you see, that's a paradox. Another example of paradox would be an instance where an unstoppable force hits an immovable body, right? So if it is an immovable body, can it move? It cannot. But if it is an unstoppable body that hits the immovable body, then it must move, right? So you see, that's a paradox. It's mutually contradictory, right? Similarly, Gandhi says this quest for truth is contradictory. It is simple and difficult at the same time, right? Because it is something which may appear impossible to do for an arrogant person. A person who does not have any humility will find it very difficult. But an innocent child, a child with innocence and humility, all the childlike characteristics, all the qualities that William Blake talks about in his Songs of Innocence, a person with that degree of innocence can easily understand and follow the principles and quest for truth. Right? Hopefully, you are able to see the paradox here. Now, Gandhi uses one of the rare instances where Gandhi uses a metaphor. He says the seeker after truth, or in other words, the person who is seeking the truth, should be humbler than the dust. He says that in his metaphor, he says the entire world crushes the dust under its feet, but the seeker of truth, should be so humble that even the dust, which is crushed by everything in the world, by shoes, by vehicles, by the entire weight of the world, that crushes the dust. Even the dust should be able to crush a person who is seeking the truth. So essentially, if someone is seeking the truth, that person must accept to be crushed, right? That person must accept to be broken down into bits. So only then, and not till then, will he have a glimpse of truth. So finally, he says that the dialogue between Vasishtha and Vishwamitra makes this abundantly clear. He also says that Christianity and Islam also bear the same principles in regard to truth. They also have the same faith when it comes to truth, right? So finally, let's go into the last excerpt. Gandhi says, I hope and pray that no one will regard the advice interspersed in the following chapters as authoritative. Now, remember that in the previous lecture I had mentioned that Gandhi compares himself to a scientist who has given a lot of thought to his experiment, who has thoroughly conducted his experiments, but accepts the conclusions of his experiments with an open mind, always entertaining the possibility that more conclusions are possible and that the conclusions may also be contradictory, right? So similarly, Gandhi says that I want my readers to be aware that my advice is not authoritative. I am no authority. Whatever I am saying in this book is not absolute. You can update what I am saying. Approach what I am saying with an open mind. Do not think that everything Gandhi has written is conclusive and nothing can be added to it. Right? So he says the experiments narrated should be regarded as illustrations, in the light of which everyone may carry on his own experiments according to his own inclination and capacity. So Gandhi says that do not treat what I said in this book as absolute. Rather, treat it as a template and use that template in your own lives, and see that in your own life you may have different results with those experimentations, right? So he does not say follow me to the last dot. He approaches this again like a scientist, reminding his readers again and again, multiple times he's doing this, that what he says is not the final word. He says, I trust that to this limited extent, the illustrations will be really helpful, because I am not going either to conceal or understate any ugly things that must be told. So Gandhi is saying, I'm going to write this book uncompromisingly. I'm not going to hide my faults. If I have stolen, I'm going to mention that, right? If I have done something wrong, if I have hurt someone, I'm going to mention that too. So essentially he's saying I'm not going to either conceal or understate. So if I have done something wrong in my life, I am not going to cover up for it. I am going to state it in as factual a way as possible, right? If it was an ugly thing, I will mention it as an ugly thing. He says, I hope to acquaint the reader fully with my faults and errors. My purpose is to describe experiments in the science of Satyagraha, not to say how good I am. Again, to repeat something he said previously, this is a book not intended to self praise, right? You will find instances where he mentions incidents from his life which are very untoward, right? Which he could have easily concealed, like instances of stealing, right? Instances of something that was socially not acceptable at that time, such as smoking, meat eating, etc., etc. But he does not hide those. He says again, to repeat, my purpose is to describe experiments in the science of Satyagraha. So his experiments with truth, right? In judging myself, I shall try to be as harsh as truth as I want others also to be, right? So that is, the last word for the introductory chapter, and with this we end our lectures on the most important chapter, I would say, because the following chapters are mostly the experiments themselves, right? But the insight that you need to understand those experiments and to read the text, and also to answer many of the questions that the later chapters will give rise to, this chapter, the introductory chapter, is the most important. And with today's lecture, we have concluded uh, the introductory chapter.